Hogwarts Legacy was an absolutely massive game with over 40 million copies sold to date. This was one of those releases where it felt like everyone had at least some level of curiosity, even people who don't usually follow games that closely, and I totally get it. A full open world RPG set in Hogwarts is the kind of idea that basically sells itself. For years, people have wanted a game that would let them walk through the castle, get sorted into a house, learn spells, and fly around on a broom and actually feel like they were living inside that world. And I just wrapped up my 30-hour playthrough where I spent the majority of my time in the main story, dabbled in just about every side activity, and what I came away with was a game that absolutely understands the fantasy in some areas, but feels surprisingly thin in others. So this video is going to be everything I have to say about Hogwarts Legacy. Now, the world of Hogwarts Legacy is admittedly one of the best aspects that the game offers up. The first few hours of the game are easily some of the strongest. That first look at the castle, the whole sorting ceremony where you get placed into a house, the first moments in the common room, that setup is genuinely fantastic. It creates this sense of authenticity that just about any Harry Potter fan would love and probably did love. That opening stretch understands that before anything else matters, the game has to sell you on the idea that you are actually here, and for a while, it absolutely does that. There's this feeling that everything about Hogwarts is handcrafted, all the little environmental details that fill up every hallway, the moving portraits, which are honestly one of my favorite aspects, just stopping and staring at them, the students walking around, ghosts flying through the hallways, suits of armor moving, the beautiful stained glass windows. I could go on, but the point I want to make is that it just feels authentic and it's really fun to explore and take a stroll in between missions. The castle has this really rare thing where even when you're not actively doing anything important, you kind of just want to be there. I would compare it to something like playing The Division and walking through the basically post-apocalyptic New York City. There are plenty of games where the world is technically detailed, but here the detail actually ends up supporting the fantasy. It makes the school feel like a place with history and liveliness, not just some big hub area. The fantasy of being a student at Hogwarts feels real, at least for now that is, because that fantasy gets shattered pretty quickly. That being said, there's a real contrast between roaming Hogwarts and roaming the surrounding areas in the Highlands. Now I should mention that not all the surrounding areas are measured equally. Hogsmeade was especially well done, a small town full of shops where you can buy a broom, a wand, and so much more. There was something particularly fun about exploring this small area during the changing seasons and seeing how the town would react accordingly. Hogsmeade works well because it still feels like that same fantasy. It feels like a place where students would naturally go when they're not in the castle. The Greater Highlands, on the other hand, feel very generic. If you've played really any open world game, then you know exactly what I'm talking about here. The game looks good, so that's not the point here, but it's more so the activities that are available. Enemy camps, Merlin trials, small dungeons to enter and explore. It has all these different things to do, but none of it is truly all that engaging. The reward for clearing enemy camps is often either gear or traits, and the best way I can describe the gear in this game is pointless. Dungeons reward the same sort of loot, and the Merlin trials exist to expand carrying capacity so you can carry more useless loot. The rewards don't really fit the effort you put into those areas is basically the point I'm trying to get across. This in general really hurts the wider exploration because almost every open world game out there has some sort of repetition, so I'm not going to knock it for that. The bigger issue is that the payoff rarely ever feels enough. When I go through a small dungeon, I solve a puzzle or open a chest and get another piece of gear that I already know I'm probably going to replace or sell, the motivation to complete these activities starts to fall apart. The first few times, exploration carries itself because the world is still brand new and there's lots to see and do, but after enough hours, the reward structure starts doing the opposite. It made me less excited to check every corner because I already had a pretty good idea of what I was going to find. Of course, given that the open world is so large, there needs to be a way to get around, and the game does offer two different ways to do so. the broom being my primary choice, at least because once you unlock it, the entire world immediately feels better to move through, and you get a real sense of how much there is to see and do. Flying is smooth, fast enough to make traversal painless, and it makes the Highlands more enjoyable for what it is. I also like that the broom had its own little upgrade path. Even if it's very simple, you do these time trials, you upgrade the broom, and it slowly becomes a better version of something that you're constantly using. Mounts also exist, and they are cool from a fantasy standpoint, but the broom was easily what I leaned on the most. It was quicker, more convenient, and it just fit the flow of the game much better. The world is full, and I mean full of collectibles, and this creates a nice reoccurring loop where you'll find floating pages in various locations or scrolls to read using your reveal spell. And I ended up liking this because while the lore snippets were short, it provided context on what I was looking at or where I was. That sort of collectible works back than the random loot that we get because it feeds back into the world. It gives you a reason to stop and look at the smaller details instead of just sprinting from one objective marker to the next. But this is also where the game starts to reveal something a little bit more important. Hogwarts Legacy is really good at making Hogwarts feel like a place you can explore. It is much less committed to making Hogwarts feel like a place where you're actually a student. This has probably been addressed ad nauseum at this point by YouTubers, reviewers, and fans all around the world, but it's just hard to ignore and I have to bring it up. The game does a great job at creating that initial hook. I talked about this earlier, but that hook of being placed into a house, going to the common room, meeting all the NPCs, hearing the chatter, and just existing in that moment is absolutely top tier. That is the fantasy the game puts forth. That is the thing people imagined when this game was first revealed. But the game quickly shifts off of that, and I mean very quickly. Going in as a fifth-year student means things are different, and this was a clever way for the developers to sort of fast-track everything. Being a fifth year means teachers prepare tasks for you to catch up with the other students, mostly focused on your spellcasting abilities. As the game structure, I understand why they did it. It gives the player an excuse to learn a bunch of spells really quickly and skip the slower first-year student stuff that would probably not work in a big open-world RPG. But it also means attending classes becomes a very small portion of what you end up doing, and that sells the initial hook quite short. The idea of attending classes, interacting with other students, learning spells at a steady pace, and actually taking part in the classroom side of things rather than just seeing some cutscene play out would have been way better than what we ended up with. We see some small bits of what this would have looked like. For example, in the herbology class where you go around planting mandrakes and learning about the plant growing side of the game. Similarly, the flying and beast and defense against the dark art classes are ones where you actually interact. But then you get something like the astronomy class, which has you running around finding astronomy tables, which ends up being another checklist item in the open world. A lot of the school side of Hogwarts Legacy feels like it exists just to introduce a mechanic, then the game sort of just moves on. That student fantasy gets stripped away far too quickly. Most classes just become cutscenes rather than full experiences, but I guess that's the life of a fifth-year student. You start the game feeling like you're about to live in Hogwarts, but after a while you feel like you're more just a generic open world protagonist who happens to be enrolled there. You are technically a student, but most of your time it's spent clearing enemy camps, fighting goblins, and just exploring ruins. Don't get me wrong, a lot of that can still be fun, and it is in most cases, but it is not the same fantasy that the game initially sells. Even the house you choose has no effect on the game. It's just that you get a different common room. You get some small bits of context and a few minor differences, but it does not really change your identity in any meaningful way. Your house does not shape your relationships or your reputation or your path through the story. And that feels like a huge missed opportunity because house choice should be one of the easiest ways to make the game feel more personal. I'm not saying that the game needed a full-on school simulator because I understand that was probably never the goal, but I do think there was room for more classroom interaction, more meaningful house identity, and more moments where being a Hogwarts student actually mattered beyond like the first 2 or 3 hours. Now, the majority of the game ends up being largely based around combat and exploration, but combat ended up being one of the most surprising parts of the game. I came into it thinking there would be some basic wand attacks, maybe a few spells at my disposal, and a dodge button. But what it ended up being was far better and something that I enjoyed quite a bit. Wand combat I feel like would be inherently clunky, but Hogwarts Legacy doesn't doesn't ever feel that way. Of course, the basic spell exists as a small damage dealing ability, but also more as an attack that you weave in between some of the stronger commands. This introduces spell combos which are so satisfying to pull off. Juggling enemies became one of my favorite things to do, and it's all just so intuitive. What helps is that the spells really do have clear roles. Some pull enemies in, some will launch them away, some will lift them in the air, and because of that, combat feels more like you have complete control of what you want to pull off. What I really ended up liking was how the game forces you to adapt. Basic enemies are easy to deal with for sure, but when the game throws enemies with different shield colors at you, this introduces a new layer of friction that the combat desperately needed. Some enemies require specific spells to be used in order to break their shield, thus opening them up for damage. When this was first introduced in the game, I was like, well, this is going to get kind of annoying fast, and for a little bit, admittedly, it was annoying. But I bought into the system more and more and eventually came to really enjoy the challenge of working through these large enemy groups and managing the battlefield. I like the defensive abilities too. There's a whole block and parry system which we've seen in many games, but I would liken it most to the Spider-Man games or even the Arkham games where you can parry an attack by keeping track of the indicator over your character's head. This works just fine and pulling off a parry feels good and rewarding. There are attacks that are unblockable which require you to dodge, and that helps keep you on your toes. There is something genuinely fun about the combat in general. It's very dynamic and more fast-paced than I expected, and to be fair, it's not some insanely deep combat system, but it has a good rhythm to it, and that rhythm carries a lot of the game. It's what made me want to drop into the enemy camps in the first place and clear them over and over again. Now, truthfully, I never felt like this game was difficult, and I should mention that I did in fact play on normal, but maybe the hardest difficulty was more suited for me. And no, I don't mean that as if I'm some god tier gamer. I mean, I had to do the Far Cry 5 opening sequence like 4 times when I played it. If you know, you know. But the reason I mentioned the difficulty was because I would have liked a greater challenge even on normal. I hardly ever died in the game, and if I did, it was more often due to user error than some unsurmountable challenge. Instead, I often found myself fumbling through spell sets, and that led to some frustration for a while until I got the controls down. I like that stealth was also a viable option. It's funny that the game even has the ability to pick off enemies without being seen. Like, developers really packed everything you would expect from any open world action RPG into Hogwarts Legacy. I often read about how this game feels like a generic open world game with a Harry Potter skin, and sometimes I totally see why people say that. That being said, stealth was solid enough. Enemies tend to have some decent awareness and they can spot you from a distance, and it never really becomes this massive stealth system either. It more so exists as an optional way to clear out a camp before the real fight actually starts. You can use your disillusionment spell, sneak around, and hit enemies with the petrify spell, and if you do end up investing in the stealth talent tree, it can make your skills even stronger, but most of the time, if stealth failed, then I didn't really care because the regular combat was fun enough. Now, the enemies in this game are varied, but unfortunately not enough, and I think that is a big misstep. There are so many tools to use in combat, but I never felt like the actual combat flow demanded it because of the lack of enemy types. There are dark wizards, goblins, poachers, spiders, and trolls, and a few others, but the strategy is the same for almost all of them. Just dodge, parry, break a shield or two, then rinse and repeat. Some enemies can require you to think a little bit more, like the Inferi, which asks you to deal fire damage before being able to deal any real damage to their health pool, but like that brings me to ask the question, what's the difference between doing that and simply just breaking a red shield on a dark wizard or poacher? It's the same exact thing. That's basically where the enemy variety problem really shows itself. The game technically has different enemy categories and they do have different small gimmicks that you need to account for on the fly, but most encounters still end up settling into the same rhythm. The combat system gives you a lot of spells and tools, but the enemies rarely force you to use it all in a meaningful way. But I do have to give the game credit where it's due because the combat system in general allows that sort of creativity and freedom to take down enemies however you see fit, which is always a nice touch. Now, progression in Hogwarts Legacy is very layered. There's a ton of different systems that sort of support one another, but I'll start with the gear system because it's a bit strange and one of the worst parts of the game. What's strange about it? Well, it just feels very, very tacked on. The whole game feels like it could have done without this system in place. But I guess the devs attempted to go for a looter feel for some reason, and usually I'm all for this type of system, but it just didn't click with me here, and that's coming from an ARPG fan. There's this whole rarity system that exists where you can find items ranging from common to legendary. And there are some differences between these rarities, like common ones often cannot equip a level 2 or 3 trait, and legendary ones can. Traits are something I'll touch on a little bit later. Now, usually when a game has this rarity system in place, it can be a really fun loop to go and find those rarer items, and it's a nice dopamine hit to find a legendary in a random chest, but that feeling does not exist here at all. Items don't inherently have properties attached to them, so finding a legendary item doesn't really feel any different from finding a common item. So the next real question is, well, what's the point of having any sort of gear rarity? The answer is pretty simple, but not all that satisfying. The legendary items tend to look more unique, I guess, and being able to equip a higher level trait is basically it. The system just feels shallow 90% of the time. The only reason I would change my gear would be because I found some new item that was marginally better. If it had a green arrow, that was enough for me. I was never sitting there and comparing two pieces of gear and thinking about how they would change my playstyle. I was just looking at the raw numbers, equipping the higher one, and moving on. This ends up leading to a near constant switching of gear, almost as if you're playing some loot-driven RPG like Diablo or a Path of Exile. It just makes no sense here. Now, thank God the game has a transmog system, because some of the gear you loot in this game looks absolutely ridiculous. I opted to not use the transmog system for the majority of my playthrough, and my character would often look so out of place in every scene. The spider venom goggles, the fur coat, the hat selection, it all just looked really ridiculous, and the whole fashion aspect of this game, it was chaotic. I'm willing to bet almost everyone who played this game ended up using the transmog system at some point. Even I did, and in most games I play, I could hardly care what my character looks like. You should see my cyberpunk character. Anyway, I won't harp on the whole gear system much longer, but it makes sense to talk about traits, because this is where things start to improve a little bit. So each item you have has only one trait slot. Traits are basically passive buffs to different abilities, like dealing more fire damage, reducing damage against specific enemy types, and so on. They're small, but they can be noticeable when you use the level 3 traits, and this leads to having a little bit of agency over your build, so you can hone in on dealing specific magic type, or maybe making yourself very resistant to goblins. It does help in making the experience more customizable, and adds a little bit of strategy when you're preparing for very specific fights. I can definitely see the trait system being far more valuable on the hardest difficulty, more so than on the one that I played on. Overall, the system is pretty simple, and that's fine. I could tell the developers were trying to create something approachable to everyone, and I think for what this game is, that simplicity is fine. They knew this was going to be a game played by millions of people, so having overly complex build and gear systems would likely push players away or add unneeded friction to the whole experience. I still think the game would have been better off without the gear system, just because it generally feels tacked on and shallow. If anything, I would have rather seen progression tied more heavily to spells and talents instead of constantly swapping out to the higher number gear set. That being said, the talent tree is what I would consider the secondary progression system. It's secondary because this doesn't actually matter as much as gear level does in keeping pace with enemy levels. The core tree itself feels pretty simple. It's mainly filled with passive additions like adding spell sets or increasing your Revelio range. The extra spell sets are probably the most important upgrades here, because without them, combat would feel way more limited and cluttered. Once you start unlocking more spells, you pretty much need those extra sets just to make combat flow properly, and having the resource spells in their own set was also helpful. The stealth tree exists, but it's very tiny, and I guess if you intend to be a stealth wizard for some reason, there were some upgrades here that were actually pretty noteworthy and a bit overpowered, like being able to cast a petrifying spell on one enemy and having other enemies nearby also be affected. It's almost like assassinating multiple enemies at once in Assassin's Creed. There's also the room of requirement tree, which makes potions and plants have greater effects, and if you're leaning into that playstyle, these can definitely be helpful. The spells and the dark arts tree are probably the ones that most people put their points into, and I really leaned into the spells tree, and this one is filled with mastery of different existing spells that you're already using, and I feel like this is where talents are basically at their best, because they actually make the tools that you already enjoy using feel a little bit more useful. A spell can get a wider effect, or a defensive move becomes much stronger. All things considered, considered, this is also a pretty simple skill tree, and I've used the word simple a few times now, and that's not a knock on the game at all. It's more so something to refer to and consider what the devs were going for when building the game's various systems out. The game clearly wants progression to be approachable first, and being deep isn't all that important, and that explains why a lot of these systems feel the way they do. Now, one of the game's biggest features and most talked about features is the Room of Requirement, and there's so much packed into this that it almost feels like a game within itself. Decorating the room feels good, it's very intuitive, and clearly a lot of thought was put into the user experience. Now, I'll admit I didn't spend too much time really decorating things outside of the introductory quest that I had to do. The room itself, however, is something that I kept coming back to because there are a ton of different systems tied to it. It ends up becoming a place where a bunch of the game's side systems start connecting together, whether that be the gear, the trait system, the beast, plants, potions, upgrades, all of that sort of gets routed through this one space, and honestly, it's a very smart design choice. Remember when I mentioned the traits that get placed into your gear slots? Well, in order to do that, I first needed to make an enchanted loom. This allows me to freely use the traits however I want, but there's a catch. I can't exactly craft the traits just yet because I first need to capture beasts from the open world, build a sanctuary for them in the room, then feed them and comb their fur. Only then do I get access to their material, and only then can I craft the traits. Do you see what I mean about these systems connecting to one another? This dependency is probably the strongest argument for why some of these systems exist in the first place. On their own, the beasts could have easily felt like a random side activity they can either interact with or not, and likely I probably wouldn't have interacted with it to begin with, but when the game makes you interact with it in order to improve your equipment, then there's at least a functional reason to engage with it. Now, the whole cooldown timer that pops up is very strange and honestly totally unneeded, especially in a single player game. If I recently gathered materials from a creature, I had to wait on a cooldown for 25 minutes. Yes, 25-minute cooldown. I'm surprised the game didn't have some microtransactions to make the timer disappear. Potion crafting is another activity with a big importance, but even then you have to stand there and wait for a regular healing potion to be crafted. The only question I had on my mind watching the timer go down was why? What significance does this timer exactly have? Sure, you can argue that you probably would wait some time for a potion to be made if this existed in real life, but this is a video game and it would be far better to just immediately craft the item. Okay, I understand I'm dragging this a little bit. Thankfully, the game does eventually give you the option to make a larger potion station so you're not stuck crafting one at a time. And to be fair, once you expand the room and place down more stations, the system does become less annoying. You can get multiple things going at once, leave, go do something else, and then come back later. Now, I have to bring up the fact that outside of the healing potions, I almost never used any other one despite the game forcing the player to do so for various quests. I never felt challenged enough to even consider using different potions. Like, the game really gives you all these tools, but because combat on normal never really pushed me that hard, most of these tools felt optional. Like, I knew they were there and I knew they can help me out, but I just rarely felt like I needed to actually spend my time making them and using them. The same goes for planting. It works very similar to potion crafting, but you actually have to wait a decently long time for these things to grow. Some plants take upwards of 15 minutes, but that does make sense, and you can add fertilizer to speed up the time. Plants at least have a bit more direct combat use, especially when you start throwing out mandrakes or the cabbages. I mostly treated them like bonus tools rather than something that was central to my build. If I happened to have them in my inventory, then I would put them to use. These make up the different systems that sort of interplay with one another, and in the end, it felt like the game really wanted to have some sort of mechanical factory setup where I was having potions being brewed at all times, plants being grown, and constantly visiting my creatures to care for them and gather materials. But in practice, at least for me, these were systems I interacted with only when I needed them or when a quest forced me to brew some potion or grow some plant in order to advance the main quest. That being said, I really liked how the devs made every aspect of the game worth interacting with. Everything served a purpose and nothing was ever in its own silo. Now, it's unfortunate that I actually have to talk about the main story. Alright, I'm kidding, I'm being dramatic. It's honestly not that bad at all. It's there to move the structure forward, uncovering mysteries and building that fantasy. I enjoyed it for what it was, but there was something that really annoyed me about this game, far more than I had ever anticipated. That thing being the main character. I honestly don't know what it was about them, but I could not stand them at all. Of course, we create our own character in this game with some decent creation options, but then you start the game. You start interacting with NPCs, you're in every cutscene, and every time I felt like the main character character never understood the gravity of any situation. He always spoke with such glee and amusement about everything. It creates this weird disconnect where the story is trying to treat certain moments like they're very dangerous or serious, but your character responds with very little emotion. Every time an NPC would mention some new terminology and the main character would repeat it in question form, it would cause me to physically cringe. Usually in these sorts of games, when you create your own character and you choose dialogue options and so on, you start to like your character. You might become attached to them, or they become an extension of you in some strange way. That was not the case here at all. I honestly felt like the main character was the worst part of the story, and by the end of it, I couldn't wait to move on from playing them. Now, that's not a knock on the actual main story that follows the whole ancient magic thing. That's engaging enough as it is, and it kept me pushing forward. There's a solid structure that the story is formed around, mostly around the 4 trials that you must complete as you become stronger and cover more about exactly what's happening and why. Trials do give the main story a clear spine, and I think that helps a lot. You always have some larger mystery you're working toward, even when the actual writing isn't doing anything all that special. There are a few endings, but honestly, I couldn't figure out why, since they both end the same way. I'm purposely being vague here, just to avoid any real spoilers. That choice near the end feels like it should have mattered far more than it does, especially in a game that keeps flirting with this idea of dark magic and being responsible with it, but the outcome is so similar that it ends up feeling like the decision I made was not all that meaningful. I will say, however, the main villain, who is a goblin named Ranrock, was fine. He's honestly pretty run-of-the-mill, basically trying to lead a goblin rebellion against wizard kind. The wizarding world already has some tension around how goblins are treated, but the game does not really dig into that enough for Ranrock to become all that compelling. He works as a threat, I guess, and he gives the story something to point at, but I never found him especially memorable as a villain. I think one of the most annoying things about this game is the way it structures the main quest. The professors will often give you some tasks to perform before being able to learn some major new spell that will be used in the next main quest or somewhere else down the line. These tasks will be things like craft a potion and use it, or do X thing Y times. Once you complete these objectives, you can go and learn that new spell. I get why the game is structured this way, because it leads the player to go and interact with systems they would otherwise have missed or completely ignored. In that sense, the assignments that you are given out are basically tutorials disguised as schoolwork. The game wants to make sure you know how potions work, how plants work, and how certain combat options work as well. I understand the purpose behind that because the game does have a lot going on. However, it still feels like some sort of blockade and mostly something to pad playtime. It reminds me of when other games like Anthem, for example, allowed you to push the main quest up to a certain point, then the game forced you to go and find 4 different tombs for some odd reason. I bet you weren't expecting an Anthem call out. Hogwarts Legacy does this a lot. It drives you off the main quest to go and do X, Y, and Z. It's not something I enjoy. Like when I want to push the main quest, I just want to focus and push the main quest. Thankfully, the game does offer some distractions that are worth it, like the companion quests. Some of these are particularly interesting, specifically Sebastian's, which was easily the standout for me. His questline deals more directly with the darker side of magic, and it gives the unforgivable curses a bit more context than the main story ever really did. There's a personal reason behind what he's doing, and even if you don't agree with every decision he makes, you at least understand why he keeps pursuing it further. That's what makes his questline work. It has an emotional hook to it that the main story never puts forth. There's a real conflict there involving his sister, his family, and how far he's willing to go to fix something that may not be fixable. The other 2 companion questlines are fine, but they don't measure up to Sebastian's. Poppy's works better than Natty's for me because it ties directly into the beast and poacher side of the game. Natty's gives you another student-focused storyline, but it didn't land with me the same. Now, I just want to point out how weird it is that each house doesn't have its own set of companions. This might sound like a petty argument, but wouldn't it be better if there was a set number of companions associated with each house, each with their own unique quest line tied to that house in particular? That would add immense replayability and give someone a reason to go around and play additional playthroughs. I mean, in general, there are certain parts of this game that feels like the developers just took some shortcuts, and truthfully, this is one of those. I know that would be a lot more work, but house identity is one of the most obvious things to build around in a Hogwarts RPG. If the houses barely change the experience and the companions are mostly the same no matter what you choose, then the role-playing side feels way thinner than it should. Now, even with all that said, I do think the presentation of Hogwarts Legacy deserves a lot of credit because this is probably one of the biggest reasons the game works as well as it does, and why most people enjoyed their time with it. There are some systems here that I do think are shallow, and there are plenty of areas where I wanted more from the role-playing side of things, but the game almost always looks and sounds the way it needs to. The music is a big part of that. It has a sweeping, magical feeling to it when you're walking through the castle, flying around Hogwarts, or entering Hogsmeade during one of the seasonal changes. That sort of immersion helps. The spell effects are also really well done. Combat works mechanically, but it also works visually because the spells have an impact. The lighting and interior design of Hogwarts deserves a lot of credit. The castle can look great at different times of the day, and the seasonal changes do a lot to keep familiar areas from feeling stale. Hogwarts Legacy in general is at its best when it lets you exist inside this atmosphere. Because Hogwarts looks, sounds, and feels right the majority of the time, the game can get away with some things that would have annoyed me in a far less detailed world. Honestly, I think Hogwarts Legacy is a good game. I don't think it's a perfect game, and I don't think it's close to being the best version of what this idea could eventually become. But I do think it succeeds far more than it fails. And that's probably the most important thing here. This was not an easy game to make at all, I'm sure. A full open world Hogwarts RPG is the kind of idea that sounds simple because the fantasy is so obvious, but actually turning it into a real game with combat, exploration, quests, classes, and all these different systems is a completely different thing. And for the first attempt at this scale, I think they got a lot right. The castle itself is excellent, Hogsmeade is also nice, the atmosphere is strong, flying around on a broom feels good, and combat was far better than I ever expected it to be. That alone carried a huge portion of the experience for me. I went in expecting the world to do most of the heavy lifting, but I came away surprised by how much I enjoy the actual moment-to-moment gameplay. There is a good rhythm to the fights, the spell combinations are fun, and even when the enemy variety does start to wear thin, I still liked getting into fights more often than not. But this is also a game where the more you start interacting with all these systems, the more you start to see how thin some of them are. The gear system feels completely tacked on, as I mentioned previously. The open world activities repeat too much, and there is not enough variety there. The rewards are just not strong enough to make exploration feel consistently worthwhile, and the student fantasy starts off strong and then just sort of fades into the background not long after. House choice should have mattered more. The main character annoyed me way more than I ever expected. The main story is fine, but the companion quests are where the writing feels a little bit stronger. A lot of my criticisms come from me wanting the game to go further because the foundation is clearly here. It does enough right that you can see the better version of this game sitting underneath it, and a sequel that gives more meaning to house choice, builds out more companions, makes classes more interactive, and adds more stronger role-playing consequences is going to be the perfect Hogwarts experience. So yeah, Hogwarts Legacy is flawed, it is shallow in places, it leaves a lot on the table, but it is also fun, polished, atmospheric, and far more enjoyable than I honestly expected it to be. Thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to hit that like button. If you're new here, consider subscribing. I'll see you all in the next one.